BP Oil this past week agreed to a settlement somewhere in the neighborhood of $7.8 billion to cover economic damages and also some medical concerns of those people who had to spend time doing the cleanup. The question can be, will these damages be taxed? My guess is the tax lawyer who writes in Forbes about this very concept, Rob Wood with Wood LLP in San Francisco. Rob, welcome back.
Thanks, Scott.
So talk about how damages, since you write a lot about that, Rob, talk about how they are typically taxed.
Yeah, well, it's a fairly fundamental and actually fairly simple rule, which is, although I guess discussing anything in the tax world as simple may be an oxymoron, but what the IRS does and what the tax code requires is to look at the nature of the claim that you have and basically what you are replacing with damages. So I think in the case of the BP oil spill or any other kind of accident or disaster, if you have someone who is physically injured, contracts cancer, or gets a broken leg, or wrongful death, is killed, those kinds of things are obviously physical, and the tax code at Section 104 is explicit that they are not taxed. I think the problem is when you get beyond that simple fact pattern and you sort of go to everything else, every other type of claim, it's not so simple.
And so in this case, because the settlement covers different things, everything which could be physical injury awards in some cases for the people who were injured during the cleanup, you talk about how property damages can be tax-free. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's right. So if for example, you owned a shrimp boat and the shrimp boat was destroyed, either directly in the disaster or that it was rendered valueless because it was damaged so badly or something. So basically the idea is, and I have no idea what a shrimp boat's worth, but let's say it's worth $200,000. So the boat is gone, and you then get $200,000 from BP. Is that income or not? Well, generally speaking, the answer would be, it's kind of a yes and no. It's a replacement, and there are specific tax provisions that would allow you to reinvest the proceeds. Generally, this is called an involuntary conversion, so that you wouldn't pay tax on it if you want to buy another boat. But suppose that you don't. Suppose you're just taking the 200, and of course the tax code would see that as sale proceeds for having sold your boat, even though you may not have wanted to, and you generally find that to be taxable. But on the other hand, if you, let's say you paid $200,000 for this boat a month before the oil spill, then you've got basis of $200,000 in my example, and so when the boat is destroyed and then you eventually from BP get your $200,000, that amount is a recovery of basis, which shouldn't be taxable. So I hope in that little example I've shown that a lot of it depends on the facts and depends on your numbers, and even in some cases on what you did on your taxes. So back to the shrimp boat, if the particular individual paid $200,000 for the shrimp boat, it was destroyed, and this was of course 2 years ago when the oil spill happened, then they deduct that $200,000 loss as a casualty loss on their tax return in 2010, and then they get the money now in 2012. How does that change my example? Well, once again, the act of claiming the deduction generally means that $200,000 is income. So I don't want you to think that these are simple questions, because they, even though it may seem like it, oftentimes they're not.
Well, some are cut and dry. Punitive damages, interest, as you say in the article, are always taxable. Attorney's fees are something that people have to consider. There's one aspect here, physical injury, because the physical injury or illness could materialize years down the line after somebody spent months out in the ocean cleaning up oil. How does, for example, this settlement and then the taxes relate to it work?
Well, that's a good question. I think and I don't know what, if anything, the Internal Revenue Service will do on this. It's very clear, as you suggest, Scott. It's very clear that if you contract some, if you have a physical injury or you contract some physical sickness, I mean, let's say emphysema or something, then and you get paid for that by BP, not taxable income, excludable. And you also said, and you're right, I do point it out in the article, if there is interest or punitive damages, there aren't any here, certainly no punitive damages. I don't think there's interest, at least not to my knowledge. But if there were those items, the punitives or the interest would be taxable, even if you got emphysema or some physical sickness. I believe, and I haven't studied it, but I believe the BP settlement calls for a 21-year window, during which time, as you suggest, Scott, if you later, because of exposure to oil or other toxins, you later, 5 years from now, develop emphysema or some other problem, what can you do? I guess the question would be, it shouldn't be taxable, but the question, I think, from a tax return viewpoint would be, well, if you got the money in 2012 and it doesn't appear that you are injured now, will the IRS treat it as tax-free on the assumption that you might get something later? My guess would be no, but I think the jury's still out on that question.
And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there's also one aspect of this that we've talked about before, which is attorney fees. And in the case of damages that happen to be taxed, a lot of times if you pay 40% of the settlement to the lawyer, you're taxed for the 100% of the entire settlement. And that's always something I could never understand, but that's something that you have to be aware of, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that, of course, you're referring to the Banks case, which was a 2005 U.S. Supreme Court tax case that said that in the contingent fee case, if your lawyer is paid, it doesn't matter whether you, as the client, only get a check for the 60% or whatever your cut of the deal is. Even if the lawyer is paid his 40% directly, it's still income to you, and then you have to deduct it. I guess one thing to stress about this is for all the small business people, and some not so small, who were injured in this economically injured in this mess, the BP spill, businesses can claim ordinary and necessary tax deductions, so there isn't this attorney's fee problem that individuals have. It's really a miscellaneous itemized deduction problem. I guess, Scott, one last thing I'd like to say before we adjourn is some of the questions that I might get from clients are commonsensical, and you can understand why they're asked, such as, gosh, I'm a fisherman, and thank God I wasn't physically injured, but I lost $1 million of revenue. Is that taxed or not? And the common question might be, it doesn't seem like it should be. It's income that I lost. But to answer that question, you really have to know, well, why did you get the money? What kind of injury was it? Because if you were physically injured and in a body cast and unable to fish, and you lost the $1 million of income, when you get that $1 million, it's pretty clearly tax-free. That surprises some people. Conversely, if you weren't injured, this was simply an economic loss, again, thank goodness, then it's taxable. So there are a lot of things that don't seem parallel about these rules, and you need to look at specific facts if you're affected by this.
Rob is writing in Forbes.com. You can find his articles also at woodllp.com. He is known as the tax lawyer, and you can see why. Rob, thank you.
Thank you.
And you're watching the Legal Broadcast Network.